My name is Stephen Kikowski, and I want to welcome you to this show, Celestial Navigation and Beyond. Today I plan to entertain you with some exciting and funny stories related to celestial navigation and sea travel. I think you're going to enjoy this. It'll be obvious that I enjoy it. Now, before I start, I want to tell you, don't forget to get your pins. At the end of this show, a lady in back will be handing out a pin for your lanyard that says you came to this show and any other show that you've been to. If you're missing a pin or you lost one, just let her know, and maybe she can get you one if you lost one. Also, I want to point out our guest lecturer, our other lecturer on the ship, our ship naturalist. His name is Dirk. He's in the audience today, and he's a very special guy, and he gives excellent presentations. I believe you're doing your last talk tomorrow, right? Thank God. Anyway, this is my friend Dirk back here. Aloha. Hang loose. Dirk's been really great, too. I've loved every single one of his presentations. Don't miss his tomorrow. Now, before we begin, I usually tell you about all the other shows that I'm doing. I'm not. I've done them all. That's what you missed if you didn't come, everybody. All right, let's get started. Celestial navigation. Very simply put, celestial navigation is navigating by the sun and the stars. Nearly all the explorers used it. All of them actually used it in one form or another, even up until the present day. And believe it or not, your ship's captain still has instruments on board that uses celestial navigation. Fortunately, it's just a backup. His main navigator is the well-known GPS, the Global Positioning System. But believe me when I say, thank God for GPS. Now, even if you're an expert at using celestial navigation, there's often a lot of problems. Serious problems can arise if you're solely depending on that and nothing else. What if it gets really cloudy, the dreaded fog like we had today? The sun and stars might disappear for days on end. And what do you do then, Captain? I'll tell you what you do. Sometimes you get lost. You get stranded out in the middle of nowhere. Sometimes you get shipwrecked. You land on rocks. That happened quite frequently in the early days of sea travel. Let me tell you a short story about yours truly, another captain. Ever been in that situation, guys, with your wife? Look at that. You want it to get worse? I'll tell you how to do it. Buy a boat with no experience when you move close to the ocean, because that's what I did. We left Michigan and we moved to California, and I bought a new boat. Now, I grew up having a boat on a small inland lake. I didn't know anything about celestial navigation. I didn't have to. You simply looked at the land, you picked the point, and you went for it. Well, the ocean, I found out after I bought my new boat, is rather large. I took my friends out and my wife one of the first weekends in our new boat out in the ocean. And the ocean is huge, and the weather changes really, really fast, a lot more than it does on a small lake. And we went from a beautiful sunny day very quickly to a dense fog. It was so thick you really could not see the front of my boat. And I didn't let on that I was nervous, but I was. And you know what's worse? Water carries sound. So I'm telling my wife and my friends everything's okay, and every time I shut my mouth, you could hear the waves breaking on rocks, and you couldn't tell if it was really close or if it was really far away. Well, I told my wife not to worry. I'll do the safest thing I can do. I dropped anchor. I'm not going to crash the boat if I drop anchor and just sit still till it burns off, right? What happens, I dropped anchor right in the middle of the channel to the harbor. Guess what came out of the fog? Another big boat and almost ran us over. Well, that didn't go over too big. It towed us in. It actually whoops, got a problem here. It towed us in, and you know what I got to do? This was great. When I bought the boat, it was all I could do to talk my wife into buying the boat. I couldn't buy anything else. But now I got to go to the boat store and buy everything that I convinced her was good for my health and safe. I bought a GPS, I bought all this navigation equipment. I got to buy all the accessories she wouldn't let me buy when I got the boat by being stupid. So sometimes things work out for the best. All turned out good in the end. I got lucky. Isn't it sad that at my age that's what I consider getting lucky? Now, looking back on that harrowing experience made me think about how crazy life-threatening it must have been for the early explorers. How crazy it was going out to sea, crossing vast oceans with only the stars guiding them. Heck, I was only out a mile or two and I was already in desperate straits. Think about it. These guys are no different. They were no different than the climbers of Mount Everest today. Those skydivers we see on television with the suits flying around, death-defying extreme sports. Without these people's gutsy perseverance early on, we might all be crowded onto one continent today. Now let's take a close at some simple celestial navigation. This is very easy. Here's a nice picture of the sky. Remember when you were little and your daddy took you out in the field and he pointed up there, there's the Big Dipper. We all remember the Big Dipper, Ursa Major. Well, guess what? From the Big Dipper, you can find the North Star. All you do is you come down to it, connect these 2 points, and continue to line up, and you'll find the North Star every time. Bingo, you're going north. How do you go south? You turn around. And east and west, the 2 other directions. That's very basic, and that's pretty much how it all started. Now, after studying the constellations, the planets, and stars for a long period of time, you can become familiar enough, easy with the sky, to be able to navigate just like the old sea captains did. But why waste your life studying? Why waste the time doing that at all? Because today, you can download an app on your phone. I've got SkyMap on mine. I can push a button at night, go out on the deck, and hold my phone up, and it'll show me all the different constellations. It'll read them instantly, even on a cloudy day, where you're at. And better yet, if you are interested at all, if you touch the screen on it, it'll start explaining that constellation to you, what it's called, what it's for. That's pretty neat. Well, as comforting, Christopher Columbus got to be rolling in his grave over not having one of these things. Now, as comforting as that seems, we're only going to be on the ship for a couple more days. Now, you saw how foggy it is today, right? Go out about 3 in the morning, and if you happen to see the captain up on the upper deck with his cell phone like this, we may be having a problem, guys. That's something you don't want to see on the ship. Let's go back in time. Let's go back in time a little bit, like maybe 5,000 years in time. This is when the first explorers set sail. They actually set sail. The guy was Egyptian. His name was Hanu. And this guy literally set sail. Hanu was the first to set sail with a sail in the middle of his boat, a rather large boat, I might say, right in the center of the boat. Now you might be thinking, come on, Steve, where do you get your information? I hear that all the time. You making this up? You shouldn't believe that unless it's written in stone. Well, guess what? The Egyptians were experts at it. Hieroglyphics, they wrote everything in stone. And Hanu documented all of his voyages. And it's really, really interesting to see everywhere he went. This guy traveled the Red Sea. This is amazing. Listen up. This is 5,000 years ago. This guy sailed. He actually navigated from Egypt all the way to Somalia. And he did this not only using the stars. He used poetic verses. You're going to hear a lot of that today. Poetic verses. Poetic verses that reminded him of the stars and their positions for his navigation. Now, Hanu brought back vast treasures from all over the area, perfumes, metal, exotic woods. He might be the one who started the yearning for adventures and wealth at sea. It's all very well documented. Now let's jump forward about 2,000 years from when Hanu jumped in his boat and set sail for Somalia. Let's travel back to Scandinavia, where another famous group of explorers originated. You're going to love this. An amazing group of explorers called the Vikings. Vikings were around from about 700 AD to 1066 AD. Now, just like the Egyptians, they also used the stars and the sun for navigating. And just like those before them, they used other things. They used things like the sun, the stars, but they also used birds, whales, charts, and once again, rhymes. The Vikings also used their hearing, their smell. They tasted the water to figure out when they're coming close to shore. This is pretty amazing, and they got exactly where they were going. Now, if you ever wondered just exactly how crazy it must have been sailing back then, what it was really like on one of those vessels, how big they were. Well, let me tell you, folks, it's nothing like the one we're sitting on here today. Last year when we were writing this show, I went to Oslo. We went to Norway. And in Oslo, we went to the Viking Museum in Oslo. Check it out. That's Janae, my wife, standing next to a real Viking ship. They brought it up from the bottom and restored it. Look at the size of it. It's actually pretty small for what they did. It's basically a way oversized rowboat. And these guys sailed for months at a time in storms, long before Dramamine and acupressure bands to keep you from puking. Must have been a real treat on those boats. Now, even with primitive navigation and small boats, the Vikings sailed vast, long distances. Take a look. The Vikings sailed to Britain, France, North America, Russia, Turkey, the Middle East, and yes, even North America. They were here first, believe it or not. That's truly amazing. Now, I don't know about you, but this is how I envisioned the Vikings looking for most of my early life. Wild-haired, dirty savages, rapers, looters. That's the way we see them in the movies. But you know what? A lot of them weren't. Most of them weren't. You like that, ladies? When the Vikings came to town, the women flocked to the streets, and this is true. This was especially a big problem for English men. English women preferred the Vikings as lovers. Why? Because they actually bathed once in a while. They did have that sexy long hair, and they combed it every day. And here's a shocker. They even had a habit of changing their clothes once in a while. All things that Englishmen didn't bother to do. And they did sport those hairstyles. They flaunted their wealth by wearing silk clothing, fancy clothes. They even wore leather shoes. Take a look, guys. Take a few notes here. You might learn something. You ever hear of Rudolph Valentino, a real ladies' man? Well, here's Rudolph Vikingtino on his very first Carnival Singles tour. There's always hope, guys. There's always hope. Now, how about those big horn whoops? You ever hear the phrase Renaissance man? Well, I think the Vikings were true Renaissance men. They played instruments. They played the fiddle. They played the harp. They played board games. They ice skated. They skied, they swam, they were even poets. Again, things we should try, guys. And those big horned hats we all think they wore? Not. The helmets didn't have big horns. They may have been horny, but the hats that they wore didn't have big horns. It would have been too heavy in battle. Now let me take a moment to explain something to you that I'm sure you have no clue of. How domesticated the Vikings actually were. The Vikings were global traders and colonists. I was never taught that in school. They set up settlements in Great Britain, Ireland, France, Normandy, Canada. In those oversized wooden rowboats, they brought their wives, they brought their livestock. A lot of times they intermarried with the locals. And don't act surprised here, the Vikings were very, very family-oriented, very domestic. I bet you didn't expect to hear that about the Vikings. Now we're in the 21st century. Vikings are becoming popular again. One way they're sensationalizing the Vikings is Marvel comic books. They have their superhero Thor. Check them out, ladies. Go for a Viking, look what they've done to him. Men around the world are enthralled with the Viking persona. They have fake fairs where they dress up like Vikings or dress down based on this photograph. And they reenact fake combat situations. They even build fake, authentic Viking boats. Now, how on earth do they talk their wives into wasting a weekend away from the family to do that? I don't know. You've got to agree with me, ladies. That's pretty silly, but it goes on. And then there's a Minnesota Viking. Enough said. Let's move forward. 1000 AD. Now we'll talk about the old world's best explorers who used the stars' celestial navigation to get around. The ancient Polynesians. This is very, very interesting. The ancient Polynesians regularly made their way in outrigger canoes some 2,600 miles in the open ocean from Tahiti to Hawaii. They used the sun, the moon, and the stars to basically navigate their way around. Believe it or not, by 1300 AD, the Polynesians had colonized all the islands in the Pacific. They were the largest nation on Earth at one time. That's pretty impressive. They're commonly referred to even today as the world's best explorers using celestial navigation. How did they do it? They were ingenious. They created star maps for their navigation. They created elaborate visual images on these star maps, like parrotfish and gourds. And things can actually get more interesting, guys. Listen to this. This is great. When it clouded up, the Polynesians used the wind, the direction, the size of the ocean waves. They taught themselves to use the color of the water, the color of the sky, the ways clouds formed around over some islands. And more interestingly, they used the sea and air interference caused by islands out in front of them. You got water moving this way, hit something, it's going to disrupt it down here, and they could put their hands in the water and figure out there's something coming up. And look at these cute little guys. When I first saw these, I wondered, what are these friggin' things? Well, only to be surprised that they're actually called frigates. They're little birds. These are small birds used by the Polynesians for shore sightings. These birds are very, very smart. They know if they land in water, their friggin' wings will become friggin' waterlogged and they won't be able to fly. So the Polynesians would set them loose when they thought they were close to land, or not close to land for that matter. You see, if there was no land out there, they'd return to the friggin' ship, letting the captain know there's nothing friggin' out there. Now let's go to the year 1947 for a second. Let's talk about another Thor, famous Thor. His name was Thor Heyerdahl, another explorer with his own theories about the Polynesians. He thought the Polynesians couldn't possibly have sailed eastward from the Polynesian islands. He said their navigation skills were way too primitive. Currents and trade winds were way too strong. His theory was Hawaii and then Polynesia was settled by South Americans accidentally drifting to the islands. What did he do? He said that the idea that the Polynesians were great voyagers setting out to explore and settle the Pacific was nothing but romantic nonsense. To prove his theory, he built a big raft out of balsa wood and merely drifted from South America to Hawaii using no navigation. He got lucky. He made it. Another one of those early crazy risk takers. You may have read the book or seen the movie Kon-Tiki. Well, this was an enormous blow to the Polynesian and Hawaiian egos. Who was this guy Thor Heyerdahl to imply to the world that they weren't skilled enough, they weren't smart enough, they weren't brave enough to have made those ancient voyages as many times as they did? Not being a passive society, not being a passive culture, they responded. In 1976, they formed the Polynesian Voyage Society, and they built an exact 52-foot replica of an outrigger canoe with sails to sail exactly the way that the ancient Polynesians did. Now, they successfully sailed, not drifted. They sailed and navigated 5,500 miles to Tahiti and back. It took 33 days to sail from Tahiti and back. But they did it. But that's not such an amazing feat. They had done it years before. They had just proven that they could do it. Now talk about great cultural pride returning to the Polynesian and Native Hawaiian people of the day. Over half the island's population came out to greet the Polynesian outriggers upon their return from Hawaii to Tahiti. So much for you, Thor Heyerdahl. Or is it Thor? Maybe it's Bohr, because I think he's boring. He was wrong. Now we're going to go to somebody else we all learned about in school. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. You remember that, don't you? Well, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Columbus that you don't know. Christopher Columbus not only used celestial navigation, he used a magnetic compass and dead reckoning for his navigation. Well, dead reckoning very often resulted in dead men. Didn't work real well. In dead reckoning, the compass was a great innovation for determining direction. But how did Columbus determine distance? He tried it by reciting a rhyme that took 60 seconds to recite, and he used a sand glass to time it. Not so accurate, it turned out. You see, here's something you never learned in elementary school. Over a half of Columbus's voyages ended up in total disaster. One time he spent an entire year marooned with his men in Jamaica. An entire year. Now how about some more facts we don't know about Christopher Columbus? He never sailed out to prove that the earth was round. The Greeks did it centuries earlier. Columbus wasn't the first European to discover America like we learned. Remember the Vikings, guys? They were here first. We ever taught that Columbus was a slave trader? Possibly starting the slave trade? I never learned that. You know who introduced horses to the New World? Columbus. And here's something that's really sad. Like most explorers of the day, Columbus was interested in gold. So much so that whenever he landed, he demanded the local people supply him with a certain quota of gold on a regular schedule. If they did, they were given a really nice token, kind of like my pins, to wear around their necks. And if they didn't, he had their hands chopped off. That's true. Columbus and his crew and their clothes were filthy. They wore the same threads from the day they left port to the day they landed at the end of the journey. That's right, from leaving Europe to returning to Europe. They had lice, fleas, no plumbing. And the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria that we all know about, they were as filthy as the captain and the crew. And the first voyage took 43 days. Can you imagine like that for 43 days? Let's talk about the golden age of pirates now. Let's move on. Pirates, 1650 to 1725. Now, piracy's been around forever. It even continues today. But during this golden age from 1650 to 1725, it's estimated that there were over 2,000 pirates operating in the Caribbean, North America. Now, during this period, there were 3 new instruments mariners used to help make celestial sightings to calculate latitude. You had the quadrant, the cross staff, and the astrolabe. All 3 used in an attempt to perfect celestial navigation. But all 3 had problems. The pirates also used charts. They used maps. These were very important, but they were also very, very unreliable. You see, they were filled with educated guesses. Most of the map makers had never been anyplace. They relied on information that they got from different captains, and they put the maps together. So that wasn't so accurate either. Now, nobody likes to stereotype, but you know what? You can stereotype a little bit about pirates. I'll tell you why. They actually did look like and dress like Johnny Depp in the movie Pirates of the Caribbean. Check it out. Pirates did wear typical pirates clothes that we see in the movies today. They always tied a scarf around their neck. They wore stylish clothes of wealthy Englishmen, fancy feathered hats, gold chains, expensive fabrics. They liked to look good. Often armed themselves with as many pistols as they could hanging around their neck. It was not only a scary sight, but it was also a smart move. Because in battle, the pistols hardly ever used because they were rusty. So you just get another one, get another one, get another one. Smart move. Now let's go back to the stereotypes for a second or two. Now I remember Peter Pan and Captain Hook with his wooden leg and his hook prosthesis hand. You remember that? Well, these are definitely documented tidbits of information of reality from the time. You see, during battle and rough seas, sailors would often lose a limb or two. Enter the ship's carpenter. He wasn't there just to fix the ship. You couldn't have one-legged pirates tipping over all the time. The parrot would fall off their shoulders. So the ship's carpenter would make them new limbs. And I forgot to mention a little bit about the parrots. That's true too. The seamen would capture parrots in the tropics. Why? Number one, they were beautiful, but number two, they were valuable, and they were often sold. They were allowed to sell them in the London bird markets and make a few extra bucks when they got into port. That reminds me of a funny story about a parrot. I had a buddy who lives in Los Angeles, and last year he called me up laughing, said, "What's so funny?" Because you're not going to believe this, but I'm not making any of it up. I guess a couple weeks before, he was in the living room, and he was on the computer, and his wife was in the kitchen cooking. Now, I am not spicing this story up, guys. David said he's in there, and he heard a noise, and the sliding glass door to the patio was kind of between them. And he's typing on his computer. Pam's in the kitchen, and he hears, he goes, "Did you just spit in the kitchen?" And she came out and says, "What did you just do on the carpet?" He goes, what was that? And they heard it again. So they go out on the patio, they slide the door open, and there's a big gray parrot about this big. Someone's pet had escaped. And these things are expensive. He put his arm out, he said he put his arm out and it crawled up on his head. He brought it in the house. What am I going to do with it? Pam said, put an ad on Craigslist and in the paper. You know, someone's going to claim it. And then so he put an ad in the paper. A couple days later, he went and bought a cage, put an ad in the paper. And then Pam said, you know, I just looked on the computer. Those things are worth a couple $1,000. How are we going to know it belongs to whoever shows up? He says, we'll have to figure it out. Let's just see if someone answers the ad. Sure enough, 2 days later, they get a call. They describe the bird. The people are going to come over to look at it. And Pam's yelling at David, I told you not to. How are we going to know it's theirs? So this old black Lincoln pulls up, parks in their driveway, and Pam's in the garage with David. How are we going to tell it's their bird? Says, I don't know. Calm down. So this older lady gets out, and she pops the trunk, and she goes to the trunk, and she gets a walker, and she goes to the side door of the Lincoln, and her husband gets out and gets in the walker. He starts walking up the driveway. Pam says, it's his. And it was. That's a true story. That really did happen. You cannot make up stuff as funny as true stories. Now let me tell you all about the Pirates Code. Pirates Code was a signed written contract signed by every pirate on the ship when they got on. They treat each other with respect. No fighting. No fighting till they got off the ship. The captain treated the crew with respect. They treated him with respect. The captain usually discussed with the crew how they'd sail, what their strategies were going to be, how they would split up booty. The captain would usually keep 2/3, the crew would get 1/3, and they were happy with it if it was a good pirate captain. And the pirates were great strategists also. They always had the advantage of careful planning. They were great. They'd allow their target ship to be out there for days while they watched them through those spy glasses. They'd see how many men were on the ship, how they were armed, how many guns they had. If it appeared it might be a difficult battle, the pirates would simply leave and look for a weaker ship. It was that simple. You see, an attacked ship had no means of calling an SOS to the Navy. They would just look for a weaker ship. There was only a very small naval reserve anyway, so that strategy always worked. Now back then, one of the simplest means of fooling a merchant ship was flying a false flag. You going after an English ship, fly an English flag. French ship, fly a French flag. But speaking of flags, check this one out. Whoops. Another stereotype? No. Another made-up legend? No. You see, pirates did have their own flag to fly. The skull and crossbones, that's real. For over 200 years, this was a very well-known and feared symbol throughout the Western world. Sometimes pirates wouldn't fly any flag or a fake flag to fool a ship because they depended on fear. If a ship surrendered, and they knew, other captains knew, if they surrendered their ship without a fight, the pirates wouldn't inflict violence. They weren't interested in inflicting violence. They were interested in the booty on the ship. And they'd take it and they'd let the other one go. Remember, the captains were shrewd businessmen and their crew wanted the loot. And that's how they operated. Now I'm trying to deal with facts in all of my shows. Facts that you can double check. So I double checked this one. I grew up on a lake. We played pirates all the time. And we walked the plank all the time and fell into the canal. Well, when I was writing this show, we discovered there's only been 1 or 2 documented cases in history where a pirate walked the plank. I was heartbroken. I thought that was true. But marooning a pirate on an island somewhere in the middle of nowhere, that happened all the time. If you broke the pirate's code, you were left in the middle of nowhere to fend for yourself, and that's usually where you croaked. Now, the pirates couldn't stay at sea indefinitely, so where on earth could they dock safely? Actually, there were several ports that welcomed them, and for selfish reasons. There was the town of Bath in South Carolina, and Jamaica, amongst others. Jamaica actually encouraged the pirates to come, and for very, very good reasons. The pirates spent so much money when they came into port. And the sight of so many pirate ships in port at one time discouraged any attacks by the Spanish or the French to capture Jamaica. They wouldn't go in. The pirates spent so much money on women and alcohol, they were often reduced to begging. And it's written they often spent a fortune to get one of the women to take her clothes off in public. Maybe that's where gentlemen's clubs started. Pirates were frequently granted pardons by European rulers. Why? Hoping to stop piracy. Well, it didn't. But when the Europeans went to war, they actually used the pirates. They hired the pirates because they were well-armed, well-trained as their naval reserves. Great reason to pardon them. They went to war for their country, and you know what? The public loved them for it. Now look at this guy up here. The real deal. That is Blackbeard. And he was ugly. And he really did look like this. He used his appearance to frighten his victims into surrendering. He very rarely had to use force because of what he looked like and his reputation. But it's actually been written that Blackbeard may have never actually killed anyone, just scared them to death. You ever hear the phrase, if looks could kill? This guy here was right up there. He was really strange. He often tied lit fuses under his hat to add to the fear factor. He grew his beard right up under his eyes. He twisted ribbons in his beard. Anything to add to that fear effect. And he always had those pistols hanging around his neck, 3 or 4 pistols. He was really known as the terror of the seas. How about pirate women? There were some pirate women. Real pieces of work, guys. Ever hear of the pirate captain Calico Jack? I did when I was growing up. Calico Jack was very fond of women, so much so that he had women pirates in his crew. And these women dressed like men, and they fought like men, and they were tough, they were fearless. So fearless, when the ship was finally captured, all the other pirates surrendered. And these two still fought right up to the bitter end with their cutlasses. This is an actual picture of a poster of the trial of those pirates, Calico Jack's ship. The men were scheduled on trial first, and the 2 women, as you can see in the lower paragraph, last. Mary Read and Anne Bonny, that was their name. Now the men were all found guilty right away, and they were sentenced to death, and they were hung the next day. But the women, Anne and Mary, they were also sentenced to death. But you know what? They played their last trump card. They informed the court that they were pregnant. Well, guess what? They had doctors back then, and upon close examination, it was discovered to be true. They were both pregnant, and they were both given a reprieve. Now Mary, she contracted a fever and she actually died in prison. No child support for that lucky guy. But it was never documented what happened to Anne and her baby. Now here's a handsome guy, Sir Francis Drake. Most of us think of him as a brave, forthright sea captain of a naval ship in the service of England. He was even knighted. He was even called Sir. But you know what? Sir Francis Drake was a pirate. Francis Drake was a pirate, and you know he was the favorite of the Queen. And the reason why? He brought back plunder worth $68 million, euros in today's dollars. That is a lot. He was a captain of the Golden Hind and the second to successfully sail around the world. He plundered and pillaged Spanish merchant ships, settlements. Drake was also a slave trader. He became extremely wealthy since the Queen let him keep a large portion of the booty because he brought back so much all the time. Now let's talk about longitude a while. We'll get back into real celestial navigation. The early sea captains understood the meaning of latitude. They could measure it by using the North Star and other devices that I've mentioned so far. However, no one at this time really understood longitude. Without a longitudinal measurement, positions could never accurately be pinpointed. There were many accidents, such as being smashed on the rocks, unexpected land out in the middle of nowhere, or getting lost, all caused by no knowledge of longitude. Oftentimes, captains would actually get where they were going by sheer luck. In 1675, the English king ordered an observatory built in Greenwich, England. This was to improve marine navigation and help measure the most needed longitude. An imaginary line was passed right through the center of this observatory, cutting the Earth in half, the east and the west hemisphere. It also became the base for correct time today, Greenwich time. Now, in order to correctly measure longitude, there's one very important factor needed that didn't exist. to know exactly what time it was on the ship while the ship was out at sea. You see, back in the day, they only had pendulum clocks for the most part. And on a rolling sea, a pendulum clock really didn't work all that well. Sometimes it'd stop completely. Normal changes in temperature, the fall of barometric pressure, all made these clocks inaccurate even when they were working. Well, start the quest that lasted for years, a quest for measuring longitude. Everyone jumped on this bandwagon. A lot of famous people, Sir Isaac Newton, Halley of Halley's Comet, Galileo. There were all sorts of crazy ideas and crazy experiments. No one could find the answer. Desperate, in 1714, the British government offered a prize to the person coming up with the answer. A prize amounting to several $1 million in today's dollars in 1725. Well, lo and behold, after almost 50 years, a guy named John Harrison came up with a new clock. John Harrison came up with a clock that overcame all of the problems that would measure time accurately out at sea. And this is a little bit strange. Let me explain why. You see, Harrison was not a clockmaker. He wasn't a watchmaker. Or for that matter, he wasn't even an astronomer. He didn't know anything about it. He was a carpenter. Harrison built the first accurate clock for sea journeys mainly from wood. It had very, very few metal parts, no pendulum, and it ran perfectly at sea. Quite a feat. That's a picture of it right there. That's the first clock that Harrison made. Now, who was the first captain to test it? Test this new timepiece? None other than Captain Cook. Upon his return from his first voyage using it, he had nothing but praise. He discovered that longitude could be calculated to within only 8 miles, an unheard of feat at the time. He used this new clock to circumnavigate the globe. This new chronometer helped make England the master of the seas. It helped to create the British Empire. Now, if you're interested in reading a great book about it, the title's easy, Longitude. Just get it, put it on your Kindle, and read it. It's really, really nice. Now, my wife called me over when we were writing this story. This show, actually. She called me over to her desk in the middle of the day. Come here, I got something real exciting to show you. And that one was laying on her desk, and I got pretty excited there, like most guys, you know. Only things to turn out the way they usually do, because I moved the rest of the papers, and it said sextant. The rest of the word was covered up. That's what she wanted to show me, about a sextant. Boy, was I disappointed. Now that I'm sure most of you have heard of a sextant. It was invented in 1759 by John Bird. At the time, it was a huge step in celestial navigation. But if you're obstructed by fog, there's a major problem. And it's really complicated for novices to use. It's a tremendous amount of math involved in using a sextant. There is one on most ships, on every ship, even today. But again, thank God for the GPS, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Now, we've all heard of Captain Cook, the great sea captain. Cook sailed from 1768 on his first voyage on a small wooden ship called the Endeavour. He sailed into the void, a void filled with sea monsters and imaginary continents. By the time he was killed in Hawaii, he had sailed, navigated over 200,000 miles. That's pretty incredible back then. Now, on his first voyage, let me tell you this. On that small ship, this is what he carried beside his men. 1,200 gallons of beer, 1,600 gallons of brandy and rum, 30,000 gallons of wine. Now that sounds like a carnival cruise to me. Anyway, the sailors had a twice daily ration of booze, and they were soused almost all the time. But it kept them happy during those tedious days at sea. How do we know this? Because just like Hanu, Captain Cook kept great records, great notes, notes that we still have today. The fun really started in Tahiti, everybody. It was warm. There was fruit, food, fresh water, and best of all, beautiful bare-breasted women all over the beach. They lined the beach, tempting the sailors with every lewd act that they possibly could think of. It's all in the captain's notes. Typical of the stereotype sailors of the day, they had their way with these women. Everywhere, on the ship deck, in the trees, in the huts, along the shore, everywhere. And the only thing the women wanted in return was nails. Nails for getting nailed. You see, the Tahitian men would take the nails and they'd make fish hooks out of them. and they lasted a long time. Pretty soon, so many nails were missing from the ships and pried from the ship's hull that they were getting ready to sink. This is also documented. These guys were sleeping out on the decks because there was no nails to hang their hammocks on. Cook actually ordered a flogging for anyone caught giving nails to the women. Now, I know you've heard the story of Captain Bligh, mutiny on the Bounty. That's a good one, 1789. Now, Captain Bligh actually sailed with Captain Cook. And now I'm going to tell you the rest of the story. There's a beautiful island today, right in the middle of the Pacific, 2017. It's offering free land to anybody who wants to settle there. Free land, Pitcairn Island. It's absolutely beautiful. That's what it looks like. The weather's good. It's absolutely beautiful. The inhabitants are friendly. Pitcairn Island is the British smallest colony, and the population has been shrinking for years, even though they're giving land away for free. There's only 50 islanders left here. And believe it or not, only one person has responded to this offer for free land and government aid. I wonder why. Perhaps it's because they've had a child abuse scandal going on since 2004. And guess who lives on the island? Most inhabitants are direct descendants of Christian Fletcher. He led Mutiny on the Bounty. There was 8 mutineers originally who settled on the island after the mutiny, and they brought 12 Polynesian women with them. And today, Stephen Christian, a direct descendant of Fletcher Christian, is the mayor. No wonder no one wants to move there. Now, I'd like to comment just a little bit on the GPS that I mentioned earlier, global positioning. It's our current method of navigating the seas and navigating the world. Thank goodness for this technology. GPS involves a network of orbiting satellites that can nail down a ship's position to within a few feet in a split second. The United States government created it, they own it, they maintain it, and they made it available to everybody to use for free. But take a look at this. We're out in the Pacific, guys. What would you think if this seal popped up right in the middle of the ocean next to our cruise ship with that contraption on its head? Well, I'd be confused. It looks like something a space traveler would see. But you know what? You might actually see this on a cruise ship. Because there's a new study being done by marine biologists studying where the elephant seals go for the 10 months they're not on shore. They epoxy these little GPS units on top of their head to record their movement. There's over 300 seals out there with this on top of their heads. And you know where they go for 10 months? Right where all the cruise ships go out in the Pacific. They're right out here. Can you imagine taking that picture, showing it to your grandkids and saying, yeah, we took that on the cruise ship while we're watching for whales. I guess they were too. Now, earlier in this presentation, we talked about how crazy and brave the first explorers were. Well, we still got them today. They're probably going to be around forever. Here's an example of some of them. This is a race that takes place off the Northern California coast and ends in Hawaii every year, 2,400 miles. It's called the Great Pacific Race. 2,400 miles. They have to row. No motor, in a small rowboat, no sail, no motor, no brain, from California to Hawaii. And this is some of the crazies just starting out. Don't think you could share a small boat like that for such a journey? You can always go it alone. Like this lady here. Well, last year the racers encountered some very, very hairy storms. Incredibly, 13 of the boats that started, 7 actually reached Hawaii. It took 80 days to do. Can you imagine that? That is crazy alone in that boat. But you know what? It's 2017 and there's plenty of time to pack. Because just like a cruise ship, you don't need to own the boat. For $15,000, you can be a passenger on that boat. Try talking your wife into that one. You try it first, honey. I'll go next year. Now, lastly, after all of my lectures, I try leaving you with a controversial question. I've done it with all my shows. I'm going to do it with this show. In 2009, a 14-year-old girl, Laura Decker, wanted to sail around the world by herself in a small sailboat. This little girl was 14 years old. Let me explain something. The parents said, okay. Who's missing the brains here? The Dutch government heard of this plan and they brought the parents to court to stop it. And guess what happened? They didn't stop it. They lost in court, and Laura was allowed to sail around the world solo at 14 years old. She was gone 2 years, 27,000 miles alone out in the middle of nowhere. Now that's an adventure she'll cherish the rest of her life because she made it. But what do you think, guys? Do you think parents should be allowed to encourage their kids to do something that crazy, that threatening? Think about it. Talk about it. One other question I have for you. Did you all enjoy this show? Well, I want